Hello and welcome to EMEA's Inside Talk webinar series. The title of today's presentation is Breaking Down an Acquisition in a High Growth Environment. My name is Sam Walker and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. I want to cover a couple of reminders and housekeeping items before we get started. Please use the Q&A session window on the right side of your screen to send questions to the presenters or to request technical assistance. Please keep in mind that refreshing your browser will correct most connection issues that you might experience. In order to earn CPE credit today, you must participate completely in the live webinar by logging in on time and responding to the poll questions. At this time, I'd like to introduce our featured presenter for today's program, Julia Jansen. Julia is a passionate finance leader with 10+ years experience in finance and leadership roles across the world with the Big Four, multinational corporations, innovative company builders, and hyper-growth startups. To learn more about Julia, please take a look in the speaker bio section of your console. It's great to have you with us, Julia.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sam. So I think just a quick note after I've been being introduced, which company I'm currently representing. So I work for Navan, and Navan is, you can call it an all-in-one solution around travel and expenses. So if you travel, you can do anything on the business side through us, from traveling, expensing, and getting your corporate cards. And we achieve to be a bit more than that. We actually want to make it a great experience. So we want to build a business software for people. I think that's in very short, and we're not going to spend too much time on that. And I'll just tell you more in the context of today's presentation. So I'll move forward with the agenda. So I think we've gone through the introduction, and I'll lead you a bit through my experience that I had after being actually acquired by Navan. So I worked for a different company, and Navan was acquiring this company, and tell you a bit more about how my day-to-day now looks like in this high-growth environment that we're currently facing. And I think it's fun terms for you all how we're navigating in a glocalization, because Navan is a US-based company that actually wanted to venture into EMEA, and now I'm representing the EMEA front. So how to navigate between that globalization and localization, and a few Q&A points and conclusion we have for you at the end. Moving on. So as mentioned earlier already, my presentation's my company, but I think the most interesting piece to know is what Navan does and where we're positioning ourselves in. So I'm aware that you have a business experience before. So most of you have probably done some business traveling, and you all know how painful expense reporting can be, or if you've been experienced some of the legacy system of how time consuming and increasingly difficult it is to get reimbursements. So we try to make that as seemingly and perfect to you and painless as possible. So we give corporate cards, expense management tools, and business travel all in one platform. And our goal is to become the category leader in this positioning globally, and that is our goal. So you should actually enjoy going and using our software when you do business travel and expensing. But that already leads us away from the company that I work for and what we do. And I think just a small one, I kind of didn't want to take on it too much. You might have known us under the name Trip Actions. We did a rebrand to Navan to actually encompass everything that we're doing, not only the trip and the travel part, but to actually have a name that encompassed it all. So that's why we had a rebrand, and you might still be familiar with our previous name. We're currently having more than 3,000 employees. We're across the globe at present, and I think this is going to be more interesting of why we are then, you're speaking to me, because Navan actually came across the idea of that they don't have a perfect EMEA market fit, so that they should go and buy something in EMEA So that leads us to the first poll question that I would be interested in from you to know. And I hand over to Sam to introduce that poll question.
Thank you again, Julia. And attendees, you should see the first polling question now on your screen. If you cannot see the poll question, please refresh your browser, which should correct the issue. I would like to remind all participants that you may begin responding to each question as soon as it appears on your screen. Our first polling question is, have you gone through an acquisition or merger before? And the potential responses are, yes, I worked at a company before that was acquired by another company. Mergers do count as part of that. Yes, I worked at a company that acquired another company. Or no, not yet. Please note that after selecting an answer, you must click the submit button, which is located on the right side of your screen just below the response options, in order to successfully record your answer. Julie, while we're waiting, let me ask you just a quick question. What was the biggest struggle you faced with your existing and your newly added team after the acquisition?
So I think there's several. I'm going to talk about that in the meantime. I think the biggest challenge was figuring out who my team is going to be and which team I can keep and which team needs to move somewhere else. So I think very high levelly speaking in the short period that we have, that was the biggest struggle, trying to find out where is everybody fitting. But we can touch on that a bit later in more detail. And we're already at a very high attendance rate, so I'm very excited to look at the answers. Let me move on. Yeah, that's what I was figuring. So I do see a very actually equal split across the participants. So I think 1/3 has either been acquired or acquired another company or still have that acquisition ahead of them. So I think that is definitely, so you probably experienced one side or the other before, and hopefully some of the topics I'm going to touch on will sound familiar. But we are heading, because I'm very curious just to kind of see what experiences we might have in the room and what you kind of remember of the time where you either had an acquisition or went through an acquisition, or if you haven't, what you might think is interesting next. So I'm handing back to Sam for the second poll.
Thank you again, Julia. Again, you should see the second polling question on your screen. As a reminder, if you cannot see the poll question, please refresh your browser, and that should correct the issue. I would like to remind everyone that you may begin responding to each question as soon as it appears on your screen. Our second polling question is, what do you think is the most important thing to do after an acquisition for the finance accounting leaders on the acquired side? The potential responses are figuring out which IT ERP systems to continue to use or switch, aligning on the expectations around approval flows, or close communication with your team members around the changes. And again, please be sure to click the submit button, again, located on the right side of your screen, just below the response options, in order to successfully record your answer. Julia, let me turn it back to you.
Yes, so I think we're still looking for the attendance to make sure we have a good response rate, but we are pretty much very, I'm seeing a lot of answers are floating in. So maybe let's give it a few more seconds to ensure the attendees are all getting a chance to attend. But looking pretty good. Kind of weighing my options here. It's kind of like stagnating. So I feel like I'm at the point where I'm going to click continue. There was one more movement. So if you still haven't clicked, please do so. I'm going to move over in a second. So that looks good. Okay. So now, oops, let's have a look at the answers. So I do have interesting feedback. So I think the answer with the half of the answer is the communication with the team members. And then we got, so I think the correlation with our first question would have been interesting, who had experience and who had not experience. I think the second one is the figuring out the IT and ERP systems. And then the last is aligning and expectations around approval flows. Interesting. So I think it depends on which company and at which compartment you work on. So I was focusing on finance and accounting on that question. And I'm not going to give you what I personally think as the answer. I will elaborate in the next section a bit more. And I think from what I'm explaining to you, you will know what my preferred chronologically order of priorities would be. But that's more my experience, and you can see what your peers have answered here as well. All right. Then I think we're actually moving into the first section. Ooh, yeah, there we go. Okay, and I think I felt a bit like we've kind of moved through, now we got to know each other, that you heard me speak and got an introduction a bit more about my company that I work for. And I got to know the audience a bit by what experience we have in the room around acquisitions and actually having to go being acquired, merging, or acquiring another company, as well as colleagues and peers who have not yet had that experience ahead of them. So I want to spend some more time and not rush it through on this section. So allow me a bit more time on this. Why am I speaking to you and where does this experience come from? So as I indicated at the beginning, the company that I worked for until a bit more than a year ago, I was leading the finance function of a Germany, or DACH, what we call it, the Germany, Austria, Switzerland focused travel management company that had roughly about maybe 300 employees, and we focused very much on the commercial segment of customers that do business travel in those regions. And we wanted to grow from there to be actually a European market leader for the travel management side of the house. So we figured a lot of these systems out of what that particular kind of customer likes when they travel. They like train rides, they like, making a reservation in a train. So all of these particularities. Then we had Navan, or back then also called Trip Actions, a company that was very successful in the US with a large customer base in the US, and that has kept trying to venture into that Europe or that EMEA region, but figured out that it's not that easy and a bit more tricky than originally anticipated, but wanting to be a global company serving global customers. So then the decision was to buy one of the many, but one of the major decisions was to buy our travel management company for our management, of course, for our customer base, but also for our experience of navigating in the world of the European region, of what customers may and may not want. And I think just a small anecdote. There is this one word that kind of circulates in the company of why there might have been a problem with the market, go-to-market fit for Europe, is this mysterious VAT, or value-added tax. And that's something that the US usually doesn't, the US customer is not so keen on. So that was one of the factors that needed to be figured out in order to actually serve the European customers. So that's why about like a 20x size of our company, when our company was acquired by Navan, we were actually, and the idea was to integrate fully into Navan. So Navan was a large organization that had every system and everything already set up to scale. And now we are supposed to integrate. And I think you have two ways of integration, right? You can keep it left alone as a standalone business. And for us, the goal was to actually integrate. So at the time of the acquisition, I was with the company also not for that long. So I come from a very various backgrounds of trying to, from best practices to scaling up businesses. And I came into that travel management company who had to actually do some ground zeroing on the finance and accounting. And if you worked in finance and accounting and you come in and you find your GL codes to have 100 cost centers and you actually book things every place and you do have to do a lot of cleanup and rebuild the team, And if you then actually have to go to your due diligence and being acquired, that really keeps you on your toes and you sweat a lot. But I did have already, by the time we got acquired, a team of 50 people. You might think, why would a small TNC in the European region would have a finance team of 50 people? Because we also have a big finance operation piece, like people that actually collect invoices, for example. So I came with a 50 people finance team into the acquisition. And then, of course, the biggest challenge was for the US company to look at and say, okay, what are we going to do with 50 finance folks, and how do we actually level them, position them? How do they compare? And I think this is where it's very interesting. And I think one of my lessons learned, you always, usually if it's a bigger acquisition, you have an M&A team, either in-house or externally, that steers this, either it's within the finance function, you have it externally, like a different setup, but you have an M&A team that wants to really, really integrate, and they're very, very pushy. So I learned very early that I want to lead the finance integration myself, and I don't want the M&A team that can help me with certain structures, but I want to lead it myself with my finance counterparts, and do not want to be dictated the timeline by the M&A team. So I took charge of the finance integration. So I think that's a big one of my challenges and lessons learned that I've marked down, to not let M&A dictate the integration, because they have boxes to tick, but you actually have a team of 50 people that are dear to you and you kept because they're colleagues that you like to work with, they're good performers, so you don't want them to be scared of by just a checklist that needs to be fulfilled. So I think just really stepping in and leading that finance integration yourself as a lesson learned. And then you have to imagine the next challenge was that Navan is structured in two verticals, the travel and the expense side. And then you have all the support functions supporting it. And now you bring into an organization that only thought in travel and expenses before, and you're now, okay, now we have to make a matrix organization. We're actually going to carve out EMEA, because EMEA, for Europe, is becoming a strategic focus. So you're laying in a matrix. So you have a bit of travel and a bit of expenses in EMEA, two verticals, and then you put a layer on EMEA on top. And if you've been in finance and you've worked with systems, and the systems and the reporting, and nothing is set up in a way to actually have a region carved out, you can draw all the org charts that you want of how things are supposed to look like in the future. Your systems are actually the ones that need to be your friends first, because Navan, before, the region that they've done is where people are traveling to. So Europe was when a US company traveled to Germany. So the region was Germany. So the first definitions you have to do, what is going to be EMEA? So how do we measure success in EMEA? It's actually by acquiring or adding customers that are based in Europe. No data set was there. Like, there was no support actually from anything to actually carve that out. So I think that's the first step to learn. You need to check on the systems and the processes and see whether the org charts that you are drawing of how things are supposed to be, where are the systems with this? Can systems actually support it? What kind of reporting do you want to measure success if you want to make EMEA strategically important? Can those KPIs, do you actually have the way of getting to those KPIs, and how do you get there? I think that's a very interesting one. And then, of course, in the accounting world itself, if you're local, if you come from a European world, for you, the local gap is the most important thing. So stat reporting locally is your number one goal. If you get acquired by a US-based company that is 20x your size, or has is at least way more bigger than you, then their systems and their US and their accounting will be the priority. So that means you have to actually do bridging from local GAAP to US GAAP first. And the reporting that you've done, you probably have to revamp, and you might have gone through this, the ones that have had M&A experience, so you have to revamp that. That is all nice and fine, but if you're on different ERP systems, that's going to be a hell of a ride. So the first thing I learned there is asking a gazillion questions, because that's where I felt accountants, oftentimes, they know it's very clear. You ask GAAP is, of course, everything that you've booked. How could you even imagine? And they had European entities before. So the bookkeeping was done always in US GAAP, and then only once a year you did the bridge to the statutory reporting local GAAP for the statutory filings locally, but you never monthly booked local books. So you have to high-levelly simplify and zoom out to actually understand the differences and talk to many people in the organization and try to simplify. To really try to simplify, to understand how the different systems operate, how reporting operates, and of course get help from the outside world to do the bridging potentially. So I think that's my another lesson learned around the reporting and the challenges that come across. So I can definitely urge to work on communication and trying to understand the systems and the reporting formats and trying to get fast the target picture, to understand the target picture where you're needing to go and the way how to get there. So for my team, the word TB upload, they looked at me with big eyes and said, what is a TB upload? And what does that mean? Like, what's happening? So that means actually taking some data out of our old ERP system, magically transferring it into the format that the US GAAP wants and the US reporting wants, and then uploading those trial balances into NetSuite. And actually breaking that down to actually how it looks like, what does that mean, was very magical to actually really feel and touch it, to really show the files that need to be generated and how that needs to look like. All the PowerPoints before, that doesn't help. It's still just words if you don't touch it. Another one, so I have two more from the lessons learned. So I think everything around the metrics board and carving out EMEA and that systems are your friend, around reporting and the role of our M&A, is to check first what processes are really needed immediately. So what is really important? So what things can you continue as is? I don't know, your AP process, your accounts payable. Does there need to be an approval? There's a certain threshold approval, or can you keep operating as you do and it will show up in the trial and balance report? So I figured out relatively fast that I think the most important thing is to align on new hires and any new personnel that you're adding, and that you have to follow the US standard process. And a US company at a certain size has way more elaborated processes than a smaller company of our size in Europe has. In the US, if you work for a tech company in the Silicon Valley, if you hop between Silicon Valley tech startups, a lot of times processes look similar-ish, or at least it's not a surprise. But if you tell a European company, by the way, they are like 3 different systems that actually talk to each other, and there's something like a budget ID, and that was actually done by FP&A, and then it's handed over to the recruiting system, and there's a comp spec, whatnot attached to it. Some of you probably exactly know what I'm talking about, or I hope. That is for a European smaller size company, something very, very new, even for the leaders and managers who have a lot of experience. So given that we didn't have the system support, we weren't yet in the HR system, so all of these 3 systems that actually need to talk to each other to do new hiring didn't exist yet. So I tried to kind of simplify it on a PowerPoint of what the logic is, so we could mirror it via email. So we did the whole process in the meantime, because that was actually the most important thing, to really align on who we're going to hire new until we figure out the integration. And I think this is probably getting a question about cultural differences. So I'm a German, right? So I drew the process. I said, okay, this is what you're telling me, what the idea is. Second thing I learned after figuring out what the system should be, what processes are the most crucial one that we should adhere to, trying to mirror it manually while the system support is not there. I draw how the goal process looks like. And then I was super frustrated that it took forever to actually work. And that's what the second piece of advice is: find your allies within the existing organization. Find people who are willing to help navigate and steer the waters. It might not be the most obvious one. It might not be your, I don't know, new boss or new peer or somebody that you can think of, but somebody that was actually been around in that company, fairly senior, who's seen some things and is really willing to help and be your ally, because then they tell you, of course, this is all on paper, like this is how it looks. But if you want to circumvent it and move faster, skip the 4 steps and send it, I don't know, directly to top management what you need. And then you do the second round of approvals if you really want it fast tracked, and it's accepted and it's fine. So at German, I'm very rule following, right? So I really wanted to follow. So, but then I learned from my allies to actually how the reality looks if you want to get things done quickly. And it's acceptable. Of course, you can also sometimes have issues and you can offend people if you do things not how the process should look like. But if you have allies to tell you this is actually acceptable, you can do this and this helps you to make it faster, I think that would be my second most valuable advice in the challenges. And then lastly, and then I think we can finish off this section, which is my biggest one, so don't worry, the other pieces will not be as in detail, is my biggest lesson learned when I reflect back is the team restructuring that you necessarily have to do. Because some roles might not exist anymore in the future. Some are duplicates. Some can stay. But in the majority of the cases, if you're joining a large organization, there's more specialization already happening. So the roles that you had that people were more generalists, they'll most likely have to move into either specialist roles or to take up slightly different responsibilities and maybe even align with different people than they used to or change even reporting lines. And the first exercise that was been done to the existing team that came through the acquisition is leveling. So you put the names of my team with the current position and very briefly just the scope, but actually that was not enough. And then you try to rank them into a US logic of seniority and title. So what I called a senior manager, I thought in my mind, of course, it's going to be a senior manager in the US. Yeah, boy, did I learn that the hard way. So meaning the leveling between different size companies and US tech company and non-US tech companies, the leveling can be way different. So what a title and a level mean could be completely different somewhere else. So my lesson learned is take your time with the leveling. I know your team wants to know, everybody wants to know fast, and it will create a lot of stability once it's figured out. But if you don't get it right, it will create a massive amount of friction, unhappiness, and a lot of things will not work later on if you got that wrong. So one example, probably a very easy one was, but also really hard to say, is that in Europe, a controller is actually, or doing controlling means they are just doing the reporting. They're doing the BVA, the budget versus actuals. They're actually creating, like, it's a part of the FP&A, like what we in the US call now part of the FP&A org. This is actually what a controller does. Whereas in the US, a controller is the one who owns the G&L and makes sure month-end close processes and the financials are represented and done. That's a controller, right? I mean, you heard this difference, but if you talk to a European about controller, they have in mind something that is comparable to parts of what an FP&A person does. So by actually putting my controllers that did reporting into, because I thought, this is what they do, so this seems to be closer to FP&A, and putting them a certain seniority made them suddenly being compared. So they did BVAs before and they did, month-end close reporting. They now were leveled against senior FP&A managers in a Silicon Valley tech startup who do business casing and forecasting and nothing nonstop. So you actually created very different profiles and very different departments. So I think lesson learned here is, if there is no reason to really force it and do it immediately, take your time to learn the differences and to really understand and work with some people to really get a feel for roles, descriptions, and leveling, and take your time. Because what I learned is the team, and if you communicate a lot and you don't get your team scared, they will trust you and they will be patient. And even though they don't feel comfortable, stay close to them and over-communicate, repeat. You thought you told that to them 3 times, repeat it a 4th time. That will create more stability by changing their roles and levels and settings a few times more after, because you're learning it the hard way. So, and you do want to steer your team, because systems, approvals, usually somebody has an interest in that and will drive it, but you, the one who's leading the acquisition, my personal opinion is you should care for your people and make sure you're navigating them through this uncertainty, and even be honest if if you're like, okay, I haven't figured this one out. I cannot tell you thinking about your level yet, or I don't know whom you report to. I don't know what your job might be in 3 months, but trust me, I know you, you're good. We'll find a home for you, but don't promise it if it's not the case. So if you're not in a high growth environment, that's a very difficult promise to make. But if you're in a high growth environment and they're qualified, you can usually make that promise, or at least say, we'll be in close communication. We'll find out what we can do, and I'll tell you along the way of what I'm finding out about the new organization, because not everybody loves change as much as I do. So, and you can send me off somewhere tomorrow and give me a new job scope, I'll be fine. But most people in my team, the majority of my team, likes change because else they wouldn't be in a high growth environment, but not as much. Not changing their job duties or job scopes against their will, especially not too often. So I think that's the longest section I wanted to spend on leading post-acquisition integration and the lessons learned that I had around carving out a matrix org out of a horizontal org before, how reporting, what the challenges are around reporting and systems, the role of M&A, new processes and approval flows, and the team restructuring at the leveling. Of course, there are more lessons learned in there everywhere, but I think those were some of the highlights that I wanted to share around the post-acquisition integration. So I think from there on, let me see.
Yeah, Julia, if I may interrupt just quickly before we get to the next section. You've talked obviously about terminology differences, kind of role structure differences, nomenclature differences. Did you experience any specific cultural differences between the US and EMEA teams? And if so, if you could give a couple of examples.
Yeah, so actually the funny thing is I don't think it's not necessarily US and EMEA difference. That can be as well. But EMEA, what is EMEA? EMEA is Germany, France, Poland, you name it, not UK anymore, but still EMEA, but not you. You can, so many different countries, right? So every country is different, and we have offices in Paris, we have it in London, we have our headquarters here in Germany, in Berlin. So we have in the EMEA org a lot of different cultures. So they again compare to the US culture differently. So I think for us, so I think for me the biggest, or when I talk to my team that I inherited, because I took over the existing finance setup that was there for EMEA from Navan. So I have teams now reporting from Amsterdam into me, and also from another acquisition from Sweden thereafter. When I talked to them about the cultural differences, and they said, well, I think it was probably your Germanness the most that was different. And I think one example is exactly that, like you think there's a process and somebody tells you this is the way it is, but actually there are ways around it, or you can fast track it, or if you push really hard and scream really loud, you can make things work a bit faster. And I think that is probably, and that's why I came across in that budget ID process. I'm like, why is my process not working? I'm following it. And wanting everybody to follow it, while as in the reality, if you want something urgently, there are other ways to make it go faster. So I think that was probably different. Nevertheless, I think we also got acquired because from a startup mentality and from, love for change and disrupting the market and going fast and wanting to kind of get away from the legacy setups, we were very similar, our old company and Navan. So I think that was a pretty good match. But you do feel, and I think that's a very tricky subject, the difference between how recruiting and letting go is handled in the US and how it's acceptable that this can be very fast versus Europe. So in Europe, the processes are longer. It is not as normal that you can change and be off in a company in 10 days or a day. So you have termination periods that go from 3 to 6 months that you still, after you quit, you have to remain in that company. So that creates a very, very different cultures oftentimes. And that's something you do experience, for better or worse, that there are differences coming from. So I think that would be answering that question. Send you one more question, or should we move on?
Let's move forward, please.
Good. That brings us actually to the poll question. And again, you don't need to take what I said into account. You take your personal opinion, or you base it on what you think you understood from what I've presented. So handing over to Sam for the next poll question.
Thank you again. Attendees may respond to this poll question immediately as I read through the question. Our third polling question is, what should you as a finance leader handle with care after being acquired? The potential responses are restructuring your team and the responsibilities, migration to a new IT ERP system, changing the day-to-day operation and priorities, or all of the above. Please take a moment to submit your answer and then click the submit button on the right, just below the response options. I'll ask another question quickly, Julie, while we're waiting for the responses. Sure. Based on your research, your company's research, are acquisitions expected to increase or decrease in the post-pandemic world? Or what is your opinion?
It really depends on the industry. So for example, in the company that like TMC world, you saw an increase because not many travel companies, you would have also joined and said to me, why do you join a business travel company through the pandemic, had to suffer from no travel. But then the bigger fish who actually had the cash pockets to last throughout this could take this as an opportunity and say, okay, let's just buy up the competition in the meantime. So that's what my previous company did, and created such a fun part in the accounting systems when you buy all that acquisition stuff in. So that you just buy for customers and some of the management, just in a small scale. So I think it depends on really the industry. And for some, it actually is like you need to bootstrap first, or kind of really try to cut your expenses and kind of try to stay afloat. You wouldn't be able to do M&A activities while you're just trying to navigate and survive in COVID. So I think it depends really on size of the company, the industry, and whether also that's a strategy. Why would you do an M&A? Does it fit to your strategy? Or do you actually can grow without M&A? Or you don't want to have the pain of an M&A? So different strategies around how, like if M&A is a way for you to do growth.
Thank you, Julia.
So, my pleasure. So I will see what this is saying, and I think that is an easy one, but nevertheless, let's see. Interesting. So yeah, I think all of the above I would have expected, but to see that restructuring team responsibilities is also on the top, and then a bit lower on the IT system and the changing day-to-day operations. But I think that can also probably come from personal experiences. So I can just tell you my story. During your M&A, you can have definitely had very, very different experiences. So that it might have been for you the most thing that actually you learned the lesson with. If it's not taken care with care, that will burn you later. And so I think the migration to new IT and ERP systems, if it does not handle with care, that will also haunt you for sure. So yeah, and restructuring the team responsibilities, yeah, we touched upon that. So very insightful, looking and liking the response rates. So I hope you all still stay with me after the 3 questions. And we're moving to just a very small section on a day-to-day in a high growth environment. And again, you can define high growth as you want, but I feel like the rate we are growing right now at Navan and the way of how we're changing and adding to our feature and customer and employee list, it does feel very much like a high growth environment. And I had to scale from that, let's say, I had to scale small to large startups. And right now, what I feel like by carving out EMEA in an organization that's already quite established and been around, even though it's still a startup in theory, you have to actually act a bit like a startup again. So for example, we knew EMEA customers are going to have questions about invoices, or they're going to want support in the local time zone. And you needed it quickly if you enter and you hire a lot of salespeople and you're trying to fix the product market fit with the features. So you put a lot of pressure suddenly on the system where there was a little pressure before. So you knew a lot of customers were going to ask for certain things. And you don't have the time to go and think about how to set it up properly. So you just see who's around in the org that you've just bought who can take care of this. So that's how I just came up and said, okay, one of my accountants who was actually liking customer facing, he's going to be the support person that customers can write to if they have a question about invoices, because usually the experience that I could travel as well, if a travel agent reads the word invoice, they're going to pass it on to accounting, whether accounting wants it or not. And if it has the word VAT on it, like it's going to be even worse. So, and we knew this would else create a lot of frustration if it will not be attended to. So I just set that up. And usually, you have a lot of approval processes or things that need to be discussed. I didn't have the time for that. So that's, I think, the difference of being here in EMEA or just needing to be carved out and attend to the market and need to scale up. And now kind of going back and say, okay, now I reacted to what we needed urgently, but now how do I put it back into the right places? So is it right that I'm actually having a team that does, I don't know, Stripe onboarding for customers? So yes, it's good that it's in the time zone. It's good that it's probably having local leadership, but it actually should roll up in the organization to the same team that does Stripe onboarding for US customers. So they should follow the same metrics, they should be on the same systems, they should have the same QBRs. So they need to be integrated in that system. And that's a fine tuning, right? So you want to give them the local leadership and the local touch and the flavor, but you want to run them up in the right org so they can also bring that change within and just benefit from the best practices and the way how it should be done and standardized. But that's also part of the glocalization that we can talk about in a second. And I think my day-to-day as a VP in EMEA, I think if you work in hypergrowth startups, you think you know how your day starts and it will be very different than at the end of the day, but it's also a lot of meetings and we have a 9-hour time difference to the Silicon Valley to the Palo Alto West Coast. That means by the time I'm in the evening, Palo Alto just wakes up. So I think that's part of my day-to-day. And I am very much customer facing, even though I lead the entire EMEA, APAC, GL function, payroll, financial operations and whatnot for this org. I'm also very much customer facing and working on the product market fit around our VAT and invoicing solution. So that's how my day gets very much changed if there's an escalation with a customer for sure. And I think the balancing versus short-term versus long-term business goals, what I put here, that's a really hard one because I feel like if you are in an organization that is prepping eventually, of wanting to ever go public in the future, you will, the long-term business goals will be steered around for you while the entire organization is prepping. And that's very much driven from, regulations and standards. So you will feel that shift and how this goal will actually influence every quarterly goal that you're having. And I think the most how you feel it and trying to figure it out, you want to react and you don't want to bring up the cost base crazy by adding people that kind of respond to things or do things that you need in EMEA that there's a product gap for or customers want, so you need to patch it with humans, is to keep in mind where the long road is going and to actually focus fully on your month-end close process. To make sure you dedicate the right resources. I don't know, you bring in somebody from your team who has a really good understanding of transformational processes or process improvements and really dig into your month-end close processes. We currently have in this region 4 ERP legacy systems with 4 different data sets, 4 different ways of operating. We're not yet all in NetSuite. We still have a NetSuite integration fully in front of us. So we have to do a lot of TB uploading. We still have entities with revenue in this region. So all of that will make the month-end close process very cumbersome, manual. So spending a lot of time on those goals of making sure the month-end close is seamless and perfect as possible, I would also definitely recommend. And then, of course, there are strategic goals, but I think they're more talking about the people management and operating my current scope. So that's very, very much my focus right now in the day-to-day. And it's, I think, touching it a bit, half of it is people management and talking to the people that I manage and lead and steering and helping them to be successful in an org that is for half of them new and for half of them very known. And the other half probably a bit more on the content or meetings or any of that piece. So yeah, I think that's a day-to-day. So I think that is a shorter section. So Sam, any question on this part, or shall we move on?
Okay. Yes, please. Again, you've obviously talked in some level of detail about the process of integration, some of the major considerations. If you could just prioritize perhaps 2 or 3 of what you think are the most difficult aspects of merging the systems and the procedures for your 2 companies that were involved in the acquisition.
I think the biggest challenge is if the system that you're coming from hasn't booked as granular as you needed it to, so you can bridge it to the new system. So for example, when I joined my previous company, so the company that was acquired, cost centers weren't cleaned up. You had a lot of creditors just booked bulk on one creditor. You didn't separate creditors. You didn't have different GL accounts to separate between certain travel supplies. So all of that, luckily, I started when I joined, but that granularity wasn't there. So if you have to then integrate in a company at that size that actually wants to perfectly know what's on a GL account, so in order to be able to match it perfectly to where it should be, then you have a problem if you don't have that data transparency and cleanliness. And for some of you that work in large corporations, they're like, what do you mean? Like it's not booked in that way. But remember, if it's a smaller entity with lower statutory requirements and you just do reporting that is needed to steer the business, you don't need to be at that level that a company that is already kind of prepping for an IPO, right? Like you don't need that level of granularity and perfection to be successful, and it's also not statutory required. Of course, it would be great, but I've taken over a lot of accounting backends that are not at that level. You actually have to get to that level. So that will make it really difficult. So no matter which system you're using, if your data and how the way of accounting booked it before is not granular and people don't know what's actually going on in the books to that level of detail, it will be really hard to map to the US organization or to any other system. So I think that is one. And I think the other one, and that's I learned the hard way, is that the HR systems, of course, cater to the US employees mostly, right, and to the payroll. And then you come in with the legal entities all here into different payrolls in EMEA, and payroll data that is required to do a good payroll is way more detailed. So the HR systems that we had are asking for things of your child certificate, the date of birth of your child, like things that GDPR leaving aside, but a very high level of detail to actually be audit ready and to actually do a proper payroll. And of course, that HR system, if it's US centric, doesn't cater to that. That you actually have to work and build this out, and probably from scratch, and get the resource and the help that this is actually going to be important, because half of the workforce of our company is actually in EMEA. You actually have to drive that change and drive that importance. Otherwise, you come from a tech-forward solution that you had established, and you're going back in time and you're having to do manual payroll reporting that's also very error-prone. So I think those would be 2 examples.
Thank you, Julia.
My pleasure. Let's see. I think we're already very good in time. So I think I have one more section, so I try to keep that slow and leave a bit more time for the Q&A. I love that word glocalization. It's a mixture of global and local. And so it's kind of like adapting a global product that you've built from the beginning to actually serve a global customer, but you actually need to make it a bit more local so you can actually cater to the local markets. And one of them would have been VAT, for example. So you wouldn't have very big happiness in the European markets if you can't do VAT invoicing, or at least have a solution for it. So there will be some localization needed to your product, but I'm actually here more to talk about what localization means for the finance function or of an acquired company or acquired function, is how much does it make sense to keep in a local market versus probably the more centralizing or keeping from a global perspective, you can also call the global part then centralization versus what setup that you keep locally. So of course, if you do an acquisition, there is going to be something. It's not going to be a white sheet of paper. But to actually think about it and pretend there's a white sheet of paper, what finance functions make sense to localize, what doesn't, and where are you right now, and should you make any changes to make it actually more efficient? So taking out the duplication out. So for example, the organizations that I took in after the acquisition, so all the entities that we had in EMEA with the team in Amsterdam, they did AP, so accounts payable. The team that I brought in, they did AP. And actually we had two people because we had two different organizations using ERP systems. So does it make to potentially think about centralizing them and centralizing them in Berlin, in Amsterdam, or in the US? And what criteria do you decide on them centralizing or keeping it local? And I think there's a mixture of course, where you come from, but also, do you really need local expertise, or is it a complex task, and how much does it take? And then there's costs, but that's last for me. So I think what I'd identified is how to execute is, of course, to check where you're from, but then, and there's always the people behind, right? So you need to also check on the skill set. So for example, the AP, we actually had on my team somebody who loved AP. Like he loves it. He can do AP morning to end, no change needed. And the team in Amsterdam, they were like, can I just send AP off to the US? And we're like, yeah, no, why don't we put it all into the person in my team who loves AP? Of course, he has to then navigate several ERP systems, but he loves it. Let's do it. Just build a team with him and then put it all under him. So that the execution was based on, of course, checking what people like and where they're skilled and whether it's a fit, but also checking if it makes sense to centralize certain parts and it actually is enough workload to put into a whole team or actually into people. The other thing that I would say is the opposite of keeping it global or centralized is payroll. I don't think, as I mentioned earlier from the HR systems, it will make a lot of sense to ask somebody from the US side to do a German payroll and trying to educate and train what the fun is around the church tax and why the Germans care about and tax train tickets differently as a benefit. And so all of these things, I would say payroll is the opposite on that. I think you should keep as local as possible because that local expertise is needed. And there's probably not so many synergies with the US side except system support potentially. So I think that there's different factors you can decide. And the business impact long-term is to constantly check whether you have the right setup and whether you should move to you have now enough workload and enough complexity and enough costs built up if you spread it to check if you should go for either localization or centralization or both and where it should best live. So yeah, I think that's my prepping company for glocalization on the finance team side, not on the feature side.
Yeah, Julia, just a quick follow-up. You obviously talked about some of the considerations of globally centralized versus localized. Can you talk about, or are there other important considerations that people need to contemplate as they consider those functions and those activities that should be centralized versus localized?
I think there's, I hope I touched on this enough. It's also what the people that you have, how the talent pool looks like and what they are good in versus not. And I unfortunately also had a surprise that I thought taking it for granted because you think it is for granted, but then you realize it's not. Language skills, for example. So I actually brought a team in. The English skill is not at that level where it should be for some to actually operate in a company that you don't feel there's a difference. So it's not like at that level that comes at ease. So even though they're the most skilled and most dedicated people, you probably have to change the role for them. So that will impact your decisions as well. That like you think you have a perfect and most efficient process in place and you're given a role that makes the most sense, but then suddenly you might have to either put it back with the headquarter function or give it to another team because there's actually a skill set missing that you might have overlooked. So it's the people that also will drive some of the change. And of course, there's always going to be something, if it's really menial, if it's really repetitive, it It's not very complex. It's a lot of work. You will probably never get the product to support it. You'll never get efficiency in there. Go for the complete outsourcing and try to find a low-cost place that is able to take it, and you can outsource that as well. But the second you have processes that keep changing, you need to improvise, you need to be creative, you need to solve for it, keep it close where your leadership sits so you can react quickly and adapt.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I think we are now moving on to, the last polling question.
Thank you again, Julia. I would like to remind all the participants to please refresh your browser if you cannot see these questions. The fourth polling question is cost the main factor to consider for localization? The potential responses are yes or no. Please be sure to click the submit button, which is located on the right side of your screen just below the response options, in order to successfully record your answer.
Talking about time zone differences. Sorry, Sam, talking about time zone differences, it's getting dark here. Let me just turn on the light. One thing I did not consider. All right, there we go.
While we're waiting for the responses to build, understanding we don't have too much time left, Julia, can you talk about some of the reasons that you decided to stay with the combined company after the acquisition?
Yes, very good question. So I think after you've actually led a finance function in a company yourself, and then you're actually being part of a new organization where you're now not in the corporate headquarters, but we're actually in the region. It's a good question of what the factors can be why you're staying. So for me, it was for sure that I love the people, I love the energy, I like the speed, I like the challenges that awaited me, and that I still have that my team remained. I can work with my team, and my team actually extended. So I think those were factors. Plus my management stayed, so my founders of the company, they took up great roles in the org, so I can still work with them. So I think that were the key deciding factors. And then I think the important one is that also I think finance is in our product and our solutions, so I can actually shape also our product and going forward, so I can actually shape how we do invoicing in EMEA. So that is also adding purpose for me.
Thank you.
Good. My pleasure. Then let's see what the factors question is turning out to be. Interesting. So there is actually also from experience, most likely also a high response rate on the cost. And then there's also a bit more on the a no piece. So I would agree it's a big factor, but for me, it's definitely not the only one, especially when it comes to complex and high risk and high impact jobs. Good. I think that is already the last poll question. Oh, did I click too fast?
Thank you again, Julia.
There you go.
Attendees should see the evaluation survey now on your screen. If it did not open, please click the evaluation survey icon at the bottom of your screen for access. We appreciate your feedback, so please complete the survey while we address some of the audience questions. Let me remind participants to send us your questions and comments by typing them into the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. Just a quick question while we're waiting, Julia. Where they are present, what is your experience? What considerations need to be taken into account related to shared service centers and how those entities get merged together?
So I think shared service centers, again, it's probably a more difficult question, but shared service centers, I think, can make a lot of sense if you have the processes established that you want to outsource or share. So I think if it's purely, like you say, something that is done for you versus actually sharing, I think you can, I think it makes sense. If you need I think that's purely on the outsourcing. Shared service centers, for example, when I worked for a multinational before, the entire treasury was in a shared service center for all the entities. So I think that's the size and the specialization question, when you can actually afford to specialize it that much, because it adds you that much more value if you centralize the power, and it's actually meaningful because you can then can talk to one bank for 8 markets and represent 8 markets in one, and that has actually power. So I think we had times I tried to rush that answer. It's probably a bit more time to actually answer it a bit more meaningful, but I tried to rush the 2 things that came to my mind.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Julia again for sharing her knowledge and her expertise with us today. We're very appreciative that she has made time for IMA and for our audience. And thank you for each of you for taking time to participate. We're sure that you found this to be very beneficial. So thank you again, Julia.
And thank you, Sam, for being a great moderator. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.